2004. And we're at the Warhawk Air Museum in Nampa, Idaho. And today we're interviewing Cap Kramis as part of the Veterans History Project in partnership with the Library of Congress. My name is Carol Collins, and I will be conducting the interview. Also present in the room is Allie Hill, director and camera person. Mr. Kramis, would you please tell us your full name and your date of birth?
Casper Kramis, November the 5th, 1914.
And your address?
My present address is P.O. Box 7661, Boise, Idaho.
Cap, would you tell us what branch of the service you served in and when?
I started serving with the Royal Air Force, having joined the Canadian Air Force in January of 1942. And then subsequently, about a year later, I transferred from the Royal Air Force to the United States 8th Air Force. And that would have been in 1943.
And before you went into the service, can you tell us a little about where you were born and your family life there, and a little bit of what it was like for you before the war?
Yes, I was born of Swiss parents. They both came to the Bitterroot Valley in the early 1900s. My father was before that, in the late 1800s. And he homesteaded a farm.
And the Bitterroot Valley, that's where?
In the Bitterroot Valley near Hamilton, Montana.
Montana.
And
oh, I'm sorry.
I lived on that farm for 10 years. And during that period of time, I was probably about 8 years old. There was an airplane flew over our place. That would have been in 19, probably about 1920 or 21. Flew very high over our farm. And my mother often told me that I sat outside on the chopping block that we had out beside the house and looking up in the sky, and I was enthralled with that airplane flying, and it stayed with me to this day. I just love flying. I stayed in Hamilton, Montana, graduated from high school there, and was employed until 1941 when I enlisted in the Canadian Air Force. There was some period of time that during December of 1941 and January of 1942, of course, when Pearl Harbor happened, when I and a friend arrived in Vancouver, BC, at their request to join, they now told us that we couldn't be accepted immediately as we'd expected on January the 1st of 1942 because of Pearl Harbor. There was a considerable amount of conversation between the Canadians and Washington, D.C. before the Washington, D.C. decided that we wouldn't jeopardize our citizenship by joining the Canadian Air Force, since the United States was at this point recently embroiled in the war itself.
You and your friend then joined the Canadian Air Force.
Yes.
At that time.
And we continued on until we graduated. They wanted to make me an instructor, and they wanted to make my friend a fighter pilot. I didn't want to become an instructor, and he didn't want to be a fighter pilot. We both wanted to go to Europe and fly big airplanes. So we were shipped to Europe and started our missions with the Royal Air Force Coastal Command, flying Halifax 4-engine bombers. We had done a number of missions, and then the 8th Air Force sent a message to us that requesting us to come up to London. We came up to London, and they said to us that we had some choices to make regarding our service, that the 8th Air Force would, if we wished, send us back to the United States, convert us over to B-17s, or we could not do anything. We didn't have to make any change whatsoever. Or we could take a commission at our present equivalent rank into the 8th Air Force and stay with the Royal Air Force and complete our missions doing their missions. We decided, along with probably another 10 Americans that were being interviewed, I think all of us decided that since the British had trained us and we didn't know how to salute American or anything else, we decided we'd continue on with the British, and we wore American uniforms and were paid in American dollars during this period of time.
Cap, you were telling me about your family settling in Montana, and I see that you have a picture here of your early home there. Can you tell us about that and how your parents happened to settle in the Bitterroot Valley and about your home there?
Yes, my father had homesteaded a piece of property in the early 1900s, not too far away from the property in this picture. After he had settled that other property, there became a boom in the Bitterroot Valley. There were hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of acres of apple orchards planted and producing. And so there was quite a active area at that time. My father then sold that first piece of property and bought this other one that you have the picture of.
I see a dog in the picture. Is that a dog that you had when you were a boy, or?
Well, that was probably my sister's favorite pet, an older sister. I never was very much for dogs, as I recall. And even living on the farm, I wasn't much of a horseman. My other brothers rode a horse a little bit, but I had to have either the horse had to gallop or walk. That's the only way I could stay on.
So you mentioned a sister and some other brothers. What were the siblings in your family? What other siblings did you have?
My oldest sister became a nurse, and my oldest brother worked for the Public Health Service at that time. There was a very they had a lot of problem with Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and he worked for that laboratory at that time. My next brother went to college and became a chemical engineer and worked for DuPont from the time he graduated from Ann Arbor College until his death about 20 years ago. My second sister went to Spokane Kinman College and became employed by the Montana Power Company. And the younger sister still lives in Spokane.
Were you the only one that served in the military?
Yes, I was the only one. My brother tried to get in twice, but was not able to because he'd had some problem with rheumatic fever prior to the war, and the other brother, working for DuPont as a chemical engineer, was deferred because he needed his expertise was needed for the war effort. I joined the Canadian Air Force because I had started flying in a program that was effective in the United States called CPT program, Civilian Pilot Training Program. And that was in March or April of 1941. And by October, November of 1941, I had my private pilot's license. And I knew that I wanted to fly anywhere, any way I could. And I tried to get into the United States military, into the Army, Air Force, or into the Navy, but was not able to because I was too old to be accepted. I had no college education, and my eyes weren't very good.
How old were you at that time?
I was 27 at that time. I had a friend who had gone to Canada and liked it very much, and he joined the military, and we kept in touch, and he really was instrumental in getting me enthused about going to Canada. About that time, another friend and I decided that we would go to Canada, and that's how come we did go to Canada.
Do you remember where you were and what you were doing when Pearl Harbor was bombed? Do you have any?
Yes, I remember it very well. I was skiing on Lost Trail Pass. It was a Sunday, and I'd come off the hill with a friend, and we were sitting in the car eating lunch and listening to the radio, and we heard the news about Pearl Harbor.
Cap, you said that you entered the Canadian Air Force and flew in that service, and can you tell us a little bit about what that was like for you in the, in your basic training, and how it was, what you remember about that? And
yeah, surely. When we first arrived in Vancouver, British Columbia, we were shipped to what they called a manning pool in Edmonton, Alberta. It was, of course, in the middle of the winter, and we were housed in what used to be a fairgrounds. And it was my first time of having to shower in cold water and sleep in an unheated barracks. And I can remember taking our morning drills on the sidewalks of what used to be a fairgrounds, and the sidewalks weren't what we think of as sidewalks. They were boardwalks. So we were there for about 3 months, and then we were shipped to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, where we did basic groundwork, learning about navigation and how instruments worked, and all of those things that were tests, I believe, of our ability to learn. Not that any of the subjects were, or all of the subjects were, inherently necessary for our career in flying, but to determine whether we had the capability to learn anything. So after a couple of months there, we were sent to primary training, which was in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and it was north of Saskatoon, about 100 miles. And we did our training there in in Tiger Moths. That was an interesting time. A friend of I won't tell that story. From Prince Albert, we went back to Saskatoon and did our training in twin-engine Cessna airplanes. And we completed our training there and received our commissions. And one thing about their training program is that the pilots could graduate, and if they were in the lower part of the class, they graduated with and became what they called flight sergeants. Was not a commissioned officer. And my thought through all my training, recognizing the fact that I'm not a scholar, and there were subjects that we had to learn that I had no training for, I made up my mind that I was going to do the very, very best I could, and overcome the handicaps that I felt that I had in the learning area and the previous education that I'd had. And fortunately, I was amongst those that had chosen to become commissioned officers. When we finished, they asked us if we wanted to, or they recommended that my friend become a fighter pilot and be trained accordingly, and they wanted me to become an instructor. Neither one of us cared to do that. We both wanted to fly 4-engine airplanes, and the Canadian Air Force and the British were extremely considerate of our requests. They kept us together through our entire time in the service. They could easily have moved us elsewhere, separated us. But they kept us on the same basis wherever we were based. When we went to England, Dwayne, my friend, was on another squadron on the same field. We then, from that place, which was in the south of England, we moved to Wales, and they kept us together there for a number of months. And subsequently, we were moved to the Outer Hebrides on the northwest tip of Scotland, and they kept us together there. Unfortunately, my friend Dwayne was shot down flying out of Wales, and survived a day and a night in the ocean before being rescued. And he came back from survivor's leave, and his very first flight, he volunteered to sit in for a crew training mission who had a missing co-pilot, and it was a night training mission, and they crashed and their entire crew was killed. So I lost my best friend in the war. My second best friend was from California, and when he finished his tour with my group, he went to the 8th Air Force, and he lost his life flying there, and he had quite an interesting history. I don't know if you want to hear that or not.
Well, you mentioned earlier, Cap, that you had your private pilot's license when you went into the service. How did that affect your training?
Well, it just enhanced my desire to become a real pilot. And maybe it made it possible for me to graduate and get my commission. I don't know. There's no way of knowing that, but it did help.
And when you entered the pilot's training, were they aware that you had the previous license?
No.
You didn't tell them?
No.
And why is that?
Well, I didn't want it to affect the training schedule that I might be subjected to. I wanted to be treated like everyone else.
So, Cap, you finished your training then in Canada, and then can you show us on the map and tell us where you went after that, where you were stationed, and where your flights were, and just where you were there after you finished that training?
Yes, when we first arrived from Canada into England, we were based in the south of England, just south of London, near the coast, and we flew out of there to we always flew out to Land's End here, and then we flew down the coast of France and down into this Bay of Biscay area. And our mission was to find German shipping submarines or any shore installations that needed to be investigated. After a few months here, we were moved out to Wales, I think, for purposes of conservation of time and gasoline and better observation of weather and so forth. And from Wales, we flew all of our missions in the same manner down into this area. Most of our missions were at least 8 or 10 hours, some of them as long as 12 hours, and they were all 100% at night. All the missions were done at night. This area was pretty well controlled as far as the submarine activity was concerned in that area, it was decided to start looking at the problems that we're having from the Norwegian coast. So they moved us up to the Outer Hebrides right here, and we flew missions from the Outer Hebrides to almost to Iceland, but mostly over towards the coast of Norway. We didn't like those missions very well because the thought of going down in that cold water was not very pleasant. We had to, fortunately we didn't have to go down. There were some lost, but I made only a few missions to Norway before I had completed my operations and left, but my crew continued on, and they did had quite a bit of activity in Norway.
Is there any one particular mission or experience that stands out in your mind during that time?
Well, they were pretty much routine until we saw shipping or submarines that we then made attacks on. But there's one that I always remember. We encountered what we then called St. Elmo's fire, and that is a gathering of static electricity. We were flying at night, particularly through clouds, and St. Elmo's fire was static electricity that would build up on the tips of the propellers and on the wing frame and any metal structures around the airplane. They would look like they were sparking or almost like they were on fire. And when it becomes very strong, on one occasion, came very, very strong and lasted for a minute or two, and then there was an explosion, and I went blind. I couldn't see anything, but I tried to hold the airplane in a flight level position, but I didn't know because I couldn't see any of the instruments and it was black outside. But my co-pilot was on the ball. He reached down and found a flashlight and shone it on the instruments, and we were already in a spiral heading for the ocean. And so he saved the day for us because I couldn't see. And what happened was the electricity discharged from what we call a trailing antenna that was on a wire from the center of the bottom of the airplane extending out a couple of 100 feet. The electricity had gathered on that, and when it discharged, it blew the wire off the airplane and left a hole in the bottom of the airplane about 2 or 3 inches in diameter, and of course the trailing antenna was gone. So that's one of the kind of interesting things that happened.
You said that all the flying that you did during these missions was at night. Can you tell us what that was like to do all of your fighting during the nighttime?
Yes, it wasn't at all bad. We'd take off usually considerable time after tea. We always had tea. And so it'd be dark when we'd take off. I'd take off and get set on course, and I'd go back and get another cup of tea. We always carried 2 or 3 thermoses of tea, one large one that contained, I think, maybe a gallon of tea. So I'd go back and have a gallon of tea and then sit down and take a nap till we got to combat area. Then I would come up and fly again until after we were out of the combat area, and then I'd go back until the co-pilot was ready to let me know we're about inside of land again, and then I'd come up and we'd land the airplane. When we came back, why, the routine was that we would have a tot of rum at debrief. Then we'd have the various questions and answers. Then we had that day, it was now daytime again, we'd have the rest of that day to go back and have a sleep. And the next day they had for a practice mission, and then they had scheduled for another operational mission for that 3rd or 4th night. And the way that the British did it took us at least 3 to 4 times as long to do our missions as it did, for example, B-17 pilots. So we were doing missions for a year and a half, where a comparable number of bombing missions by the B-17s over Europe would have taken maybe 3 or 4 or 5 months. So the British were really nice. I enjoyed my experience with them. And it wasn't, they didn't seem to want to rush anything. They just did everything by their own schedule and by their own time. But I had many very good friends and enjoyed the experience with the British. Our crew was made up of, we had one fellow, a gunner, who had fought in the Spanish War. And in fact, he had, I don't know what they call it, kind of a nervous situation that they get, that at night 2 or 3 times he had us doing evasive action on stars or something that he thought he saw. And so finally we had to ground him. He couldn't fly anymore. but we had we had a Russian, we had a fellow from Holland, we had two fellows from New Zealand, one from Australia, and I think two from Canada on our crew. So we had quite a cosmopolitan group of fellows.
You did indeed. Cap, we have a picture of an airplane here. Can you tell us about this picture and about your crew that was on there and how many were in your crew and just something about that? And
all right. The airplane had a complement usually of between 9 and 11 people, the pilot and co-pilot, and then the navigator had a position in the nose of the airplane. The engineer had a position just behind the co-pilot, and the radio operator was opposite him. Then we had the tail gunner, of course, was in the very back of the airplane. There was an upper turret and a lower turret, which was manned by people. And then we had the side gunners, one on each side of the fuselage. And their positions were, of course, all fully manned as soon as we arrived in combat areas. And they all had safety positions they had to assume when we were taking off and landing. Otherwise, they were pretty much relaxed until we got into combat area.
And what was your primary mission in those flights?
The primary mission was anti-submarine, anti-shipping, anti-harbor. So all of our missions were all done over the ocean. And they were all done at night. 100% of our missions were night missions. And we never did fly over 10,000 feet of altitude. Most of our altitude was around 5,000 feet. Is where we mostly cruised. And our attack positions were all the way from probably a maximum of 1,500 to 2,000 feet and down to 50 feet. And we've made attacks from 50 feet.
Cap, we have two photographs here of you in uniform. One is in the American uniform and one is in a British uniform. Can you explain why that is? And
yes. The one with me in the British uniform was taken prior to my transfer into the 8th Air Force. The British uniform was worn until about, well, I don't have the date here. You want to get a date, I guess.
Well, just what you remember. The one picture I see in the corner says 1944, and that would be when the picture was taken, I presume. That's the British one.
See, I wonder if I have a log that tells. No, it doesn't. I can't tell the date. But let's put it this way, I wore the British uniform on combat for about 10 or 12 missions, at which time I transferred to the 8th Air Force, but stayed with the British, still flying the British airplanes. And that's why there are two different pictures. Mm-hmm. I was doing the same job, but wore a British uniform initially, and then finished wearing a 8th Air Force uniform. Mm-hmm. Subsequent to having departed the military, about 40 years, I guess, I found my co-pilots telephone number in England, and I happened to be in Florida at the time. And I thought, well, I'll just call up and see if he's still with us. So I called up and I says, a man answered the telephone. And I said, is this John? He says, yeah, is this Cap? I said, John, how in the world did you know that was me? And he says, well, after flying all those missions with you, all those 40 years ago, I recognized your voice. But anyway, as a result of that, he would kind of like to delve into the history of our missions and the results of some of them. And he found out about a submarine that we had bombed about the time of D-Day in the English Channel. And he managed to find out that one of the survivors of the submarine had managed to get back to shore and had since moved to England and was married and living in London. So at this particular time that I'm talking to John on the telephone, I said, John, I said, when you go up to London to visit with this German man from the submarine, you better be careful. He might still be mad at us. So anyway, he did go up and had a wonderful visit with this German who had we had dropped bombs on many years ago. So I thought it was.
It's remarkable. It's just a remarkable thing. Headquarters, United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, Office of the Commanding General, April 1st, 1944, Award of Soldier's Medal. Under the provisions of the Army Regulations 600-45 and Circular 32, Headquarters ETOUSA, 20 March 1944, the Soldier's Medal is awarded to the following named officer: Casper D. Kramis, 0886162, First Lieutenant, Army Air Forces, United States Army, for heroism near Pembrokeshire, South Wales, England, 21 January 1944. On this date, Lieutenant Kramis was co-pilot of an airplane which crashed and caught fire at an RAF station when approaching for a landing. Lieutenant Kramis was slightly injured, but managed to escape from the wreckage. After a hurried check, he determined that 3 crew members were missing. He was fully aware that the airplane was on fire and had depth charges on board, which were likely to explode at any moment. With total disregard for his own safety, he re-entered the burning airplane and lifted the navigator, who was unconscious, out of the twisted wreckage of the nose, through the pilot's escape hatch, and lowered him to the ground. He then assisted the captain and engineer to effect the rescue of another member of the crew. The heroic actions of Lieutenant Kramis on this occasion are in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself and the armed forces of the United States. Entered military service from Montana. Can you tell us about this experience and what happened?
Well, yes, what happened was that we were just returning from a very rough flight almost to Iceland and back at night, a stormy night, and we were approaching the airport on the final leg prior to landing when there was a loud explosion. We couldn't determine what the cause of the explosion was, but we lost total control of the airplane, could not do anything, and so we landed on one wing, and the nose, and the airplane was already on fire. What had happened was determined later that the one of the propellers had flown off that support inboard engine. Propeller flown off and had flown into the fuselage of the airplane just back of the pilot's cabin, and it had severed the control cables to the ailerons and the elevators, and so we had no control. So when the airplane hit, we still had no control. The reason that I went back into the airplane, I think, after the wreckage stopped, I had found out afterwards that I had received a bump on my head that left me with a black eye, and I think I was a little bit dazed. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have gone back into that airplane. Mm-hmm. So that's the end of the story as far as I'm.
So after this experience that you described, where did you go after that? Where were you stationed then? And
at that point, or very shortly after, we moved to the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, and I flew a few missions from there, and then I moved to an Air Force base, 8th Air Force Base, near London, where I was attached to a flight section for headquarters of 8th Air Force. In this flight section, we had 7 pilots and about 20 airplanes of all different types. And our mission there was courier work and transport of VIPs and that sort of thing. So I had the opportunity at that point to fly a number of different types of airplanes, and I qualified total during my flying career about 40 different types of airplanes. But on this base we had aircraft from a Piper Cub, which is a small single-engine airplane, up to B-17 with fighters in between, and they were used for specific purposes. As an example, we had a P-51 that had a passenger seat engineered into the back of the pilot's compartment, and a colonel came out from headquarters of 8th Air Force and wanted to go to Brussels. And so I took him in the P-51. It was a matter of just 20 or 30 minutes to go to Brussels in the P-51. Other things that, missions that I had was a person by the name of Zversky, who said that he was directed by President Roosevelt to come and look at a jet airplane that we had in our hangar, which at that time jet airplanes were very, very rare. And but he only had one leg. He had an artificial one leg, and he needed to brush up on single-engine airplanes. So I took him up in a AT-6 Harvard airplane, and checked him out in that so that he could get familiar with single-engine airplanes, and then they could go and take a look at that jet airplane. I had the honor to fly with General Doolittle a number of times. What would happen was I would bring him an airplane to his little field near London from my field, which was near Oxford, and then I would move over into the right-hand seat and he'd fly to wherever we were going. Subsequent to General Doolittle's departure, the new commanding officer was named General Kepner, and he was quite a colorful person. He was only a high school graduate, or I correct that. He hadn't graduated from high school, but he rose to the rank of general, if you can imagine. It's a world record of some sort. Wonderful person to fly with, and I always flew him, except very few times he'd come up from whatever kind of airplane we were flying. One particular occasion was we were coming back from Europe to London, crossing the Channel in a twin-engine Beechcraft. I was flying, and all of a sudden we were at about 3,000 or 4,000 feet. All of a sudden he grabbed the wheel and dove the airplane, and then pretty soon he righted the airplane. I said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "Well," he says, "if you're flying a fighter airplane and you see some hostile action, you take action." And he said, "But there wasn't any hostile action." He says, I realized what happened. There was a little graze mark in the windshield, and the light hit it in such a way that a streak of light looked like a bullet." And he says, "That's when I grabbed the wheel." Another time we were flying out of London we were going to Marseille. We landed in Marseille, and then our orders said to go to Bizerta. We had, at that time, we had a DC-3. The general was, and that DC-3 had been remodeled for VIP area, and he'd been in the back of the airplane. But he came up and took the co-pilot's seat, and he kept looking at the compass, and we're out in the middle of the Mediterranean at this point. Kept looking at the compass, and pretty soon he said, "Are you sure you're on the right course?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Where are we going?" And I said, "Well, we're headed for North Africa, a place called Bizerta, near Cairo." And he says, "No, we're not. We're going to Caserta, that's near Rome." So anyway, we altered course and landed at Caserta. Then we took off next morning from Naples, and after we'd taken off, there was an explosion, and the throttles flew back on the DC-3. I didn't know why. There was some enemy activity still remaining in that area, and we thought, well, maybe we've been shot at or something, but we couldn't see any damage. And we were, at this point, going to Pisa, Leaning Tower of Pisa. We're heading there. So we finally decided that maybe it was a tire exploded. We couldn't tell what it was. So General Kepner again came up in front. He says, "Now, Kramis," he says, "are you nervous about that?" He said, "If you land the hub of that wheel is only about 10 inches, and the wheel's about 4 feet in diameter, so you're going to have trouble landing the airplane." So he said, "If you're nervous about it," he said, "just take your time, go around." "No, sir, I'm not afraid." I called the tower and said we believed we had a flat tire, and I had a VIP on board. So I landed on one wheel, and I did, fortunately, a fairly decent landing, and they had people out there with a new wheel tire for the general, and away we went again. And General Kepner was a wonderful person. He entered the flying area when the Mexican War was still going on, whenever that was, in balloons, and he was flying balloons at that time. So he was an old-timer. But he finally got his 8th grade diploma, honorary, at an air base in Florida after the war. He's now deceased. Wonderful man.
Cap, in all the years that you served in the military and the experiences that you went through, what would be one message or one thing that you'd like to leave for your children or for just people in general, and how has that experience made you or helped to make you, contributed to making you the person that you are today?
One thing that I think that was a guiding motivation was when I first joined the Canadian Air Force. I had a drive that told me that do the very best you can, give it all you've got, and even if you were to fail, you will have the knowledge that you've done the best that you possibly can do. And I've tried to install in my children the fact that no matter what you do, if you really have a drive and want to do it, you will do it. You just have to have the drive and the notion, the determination, you can do it. And it isn't whether you're a ditch digger or a carpenter or a college professor. I'm proud of you if you do the best you can, you lead an honest and honorable life.
And you've certainly exemplified that in the service that you've given to your country, and I want to thank you for serving your country and for coming here today to share your stories with us.
Thank you.